So we've already established something crucial in part 1 of this series, that liberals and social democrats in the first world are not left-wing, at least not in any meaningful sense. They stay silent while their countries commit atrocities abroad, and they show concern for people, but abandon every principle the moment it threatens their comfort. So what about first world progressives and socialists? Do they have a place in the first world anymore? With the increasingly evident decline in living standards in the first world, more first worlders are trying to understand how this has come to be. Many of them are unable to let go of the propaganda they've absorbed since childhood, which leads them to adopt many reactionary views. But at the same time, some in the first world have become open to the ideas that a more traditional left would actually support. However, the vast majority of these so-called first world leftists have walked straight into a series of traps, and these traps make them sound exactly like the conservative reactionaries they claim to oppose. I'm talking about 3 distinct types that have emerged from this mess. 3 categories that dominate first world leftist spaces: the conservative with progressive aesthetics, the Contrarians, the Purists. All 3 are equally destructive and actively hinder any real challenge to the global imperialist system. And there are 2 fundamental errors that run through all 3 groups that tie them together: an idealization of the past, and second, social conservatism. Let's start with the first point and use MAGA communists as an example. MAGA communists are exactly what their name suggests: communists who adore the United States and want to transform it into some kind of worker state. In doing so, they uncritically swallow every liberal myth that has legitimized American exceptionalism and hegemony for centuries. None of this rhetoric is unique to MAGA communists, however. This is merely the continuation of a liberal obsession with redeeming a pure America. This has become mainstream in the US, especially among Democrats.
But things weren't always this way. Over the past 160 years or so, the party has undergone a remarkable transformation from the party of Abraham Lincoln to the party of Donald Trump.
It frames GOP history as a fall from grace, a corruption of a noble past. But that's not the history of a party that actively committed genocide against Native Americans. That's not the history of a party that enforced racial segregation for decades. That's not the history of a party with a track record of overthrowing governments and committing human rights abuses all around the world. This isn't a party that fell from grace. This was a party that was always rotten to the core. What makes it more ridiculous is that this critique is coming from the Democratic Party. No American party is a party that fell from grace. They are parties that were always rotten from the core. And many of the conservative, progressive types will agree that the Republican Party has been a net negative, but only to the extent that it has been a negative for the average American.
Calling himself a liberal is the most dangerous thing in the entire Western Hemisphere. He's the most deceitful. He's like a fox, and a fox is always more dangerous in the forest than the wolf. You can see the wolf coming. You know what he's up to, but the fox will fool you. He comes at you with his mouth shaped in such a way that even though you see his teeth, you think he's smiling and you take him for a friend.
They're completely silent on its genocide of Native Americans, silent on the imperialism that has given America its wealth, and silent on all the other horrific crimes that allowed the United States to become what it is today.
But now, I always describe it, our economy now is like when my grandparents were alive, you could work one job at a factory and you'd have everything you needed and money to go take a vacation once a year. Put your kids through school, you don't have to worry about anything.
My parents shared not only an improbable love, they shared an abiding faith in the possibilities of this nation. I stand here knowing that my story is part of the larger American story, that I owe a debt to all of those who came before me, and that in no other country on earth is my story even possible. In no other country on earth is my story even possible. My story is part of the larger American story. My story is part of the larger American story. In no other country on earth is my story even possible.
This is the exact same ahistorical nonsense that is accepted by the American political mainstream. It's an ideology that constantly feels the need to uncritically defend past projects, or reminisce about a better time, a time horrible for anyone who wasn't a white American. To praise the American revolutionary tradition of 1776 is not revolutionary. To praise Lincoln as the great emancipator is a lie. To praise the Constitution of the United States as some sacred document completely ignores the founders' original intentions. It is an ignorant fairy tale Americans tell themselves to justify their massacres all around the world. The fact is that nothing about the structure of American society changed from the American War of Independence. The only thing that changed was that white Americans replaced white Brits as the rulers over the 13 colonies. To quote J. Sakai, like Bacon's rebellion, the liberty that the American revolutionists of the 1770s fought for was in large part the freedom to conquer new Indian lands and profit from the commerce of the slave trade without any restrictions or limitations. In other words, the bourgeois freedom to oppress and exploit others. The successful future of the settler capitalist demanded the scope of independent nationhood. There is no revolutionary tradition in America. The only tradition America has relating to revolutions is preventing them. And this is where all the people of all ideologies meet in America. They ignore that the United States was not a nation that got corrupted. It was an imperialist settler colonial project from its inception, and it still is. The golden age they implicitly point to was a fleeting social compromise for white workers, built directly on a foundation of brutal segregation, redlining, and the vast colonial plunder of the global South. To say that this was a golden age is to make clear that this was only a project for Americans.
And I think that they want a country also that celebrates our history rather than says that it's all racist or it's all misogynist. I mean, it's crazy what we're seeing right now.
That's precisely why the issue isn't just that MAGA communism is a farce, but also a broader left that claims to be anti-imperialist, while clinging to the very national identity that is imperialist. This results in the left and right forming a coalition on false premises. We especially see this when prominent conservative and progressive pundits get together over the genocide in Palestine. They say that the majority of Americans support Palestine.
The common people of America, not as much as China, but in America, the overwhelming majority supports Gaza and the Palestinian resistance.
But this is just blatantly false. And let's be honest about why they support Palestine. It's not because they believe that Palestinians are human. It's not because they believe that they have a right to self-determination. It's definitely not because they believe that the Zionist settler colonial state of Israel has no right to exist. It's because they are spending too much money. It's because America isn't getting enough attention.
I don't even care. It's my country. And they've been here for so long. Fought in all of these wars. My ancestors, and I'm sure yours, would be totally shocked by some of the conversations. Foreign flags in the Congress? Are you joking? Get out.
It's because they believe that the Jews control everything.
I was friends with a lot of the Daily Wire writers, not just Cassie Dillon, but many of them were Jewish. And I would ask them point blank, I would say, so why do we give Israel all this money? $3.8 billion per year? What is that for? And they would say, well, you know, there's a really good answer for that, but you're asking it in the wrong way. You're asking it in an anti-Semitic way. And eventually they said, you know what? We're not going to talk to you anymore.
No, he was asking the right questions. In fact, I wish more Americans asked those questions.
Where does my support for Israel come from? Number one, because biblically we're commanded to support Israel. But number two,
Hold on.
I'm not holding on.
Hold on. You're a senator, and now you're throwing out theology, and I am a Christian, and I am allowed to weigh in on this. We are commanded as Christians to support the government of Israel. So that's what Genesis, that's what God is talking about.
The nation of Israel, yes.
Is the nation
the
God's
descendants of
referring
Abraham.
to in Genesis, is that the same as the country run by Benjamin Netanyahu right now?
Yes.
It is.
And I'm really happy he said that, because when you hear it, you realize how ridiculous it sounds. That his number one reason that I support Israel is because the Bible commands me to do so. It absolutely does not command you to support the modern 1948 created state of Israel.
This should be absolutely embarrassing to anyone who actually cares about the issue. The problem in Palestine is not that a couple dollars of your taxes are being sent to Israel. It's not that politicians aren't America first enough. It's not that a secret group of Jews control the world. The problem is that a group of people are being genocided by settler-colonialists for the crime of existing. The problem is that the system that allows Israel to exist is the same system that allows the West to exist. But these people can never bring themselves to that conclusion while they support other genocidal states. Keeping in line with broader American trends, the LGBT community has been identified by many American leftists not as a collection of minorities, but as a group trying to destroy the family unit, trying to push transgender ideology, trying to attack the American way of life.
Unfortunately, communism in the West has become synonymous with just cultural liberalism for a lot of people. In America, communism for the right and the left has kind of become synonymous with a college-aged person with pink or blue hair, and their pronouns are like they, them. You know, it's like crazy stuff, promoting a lot of cultural degeneracy and trying to break up the family unit, all these sorts of things.
At that time, son having his genital removed because being confirmed by his elementary teacher that he's not he but she.
It was what? His what? It's they.
His son.
China is the ages of traditional value. What do you think, Grayson?
I think the irony is that what communists have been criticized for, by the right especially, is being anti-traditional, being the kind of vanguard of just like abstract and anti-popular trends, whether it be the kind of drastic surgeries that he's speaking about, or other kind of just innovations in the way that we conceive of our social relations in general. The reason why the media pays so much attention is because these are very lucrative stories. The other reason is that it keeps people dumb. It keeps them fighting over things that don't ultimately affect them.
In response to being called out on their ignorance, they always have some typical conservative or liberal excuse. I don't care what they do. I'm not against it, or I'm not transphobic, just don't rub it in my face.
Look, we need to focus on very specific instances right now, hurting the people. Talking about complex, abstract concepts every day with those theoretics or politicians saying democracy, freedom, but having their kids telling them to cut genitals is evil. It's pure evil.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks! I mean, give me a break. You think I am like shocked by it, so I'm up here bashing it because I don't like gay people? I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay. Frogs gay. Huh?
But at the same time, progressives come up with similar responses. They're doing it in the privacy of their own room. Why do you care? Or even worse, everyone deserves respect. The problem with all these responses is that they assume that this is an issue of respect or morality, but it isn't. The scientific research on these issues makes it perfectly clear that being LGBT is not some sort of mental illness, an issue of individual rights, or part of a secret agenda.
My aim is to show you that no, homosexuality is not inherently moral, but it isn't immoral either. It's got absolutely nothing to do with morality, and you therefore have no right to morally judge people for it. Now, there are two boxes that must be checked in order to say that something does fall within the moral sphere. The first of these is that there must be a conscious agent committing the action, and the second is that the action must have some effect on human well-being. But think about it for a moment, and you'll realize that even if being gay is determined by upbringing and environmental factors, it's still not a choice. Did you choose your music taste? Here's a trait that certainly doesn't come from your genes, but rather from your environment and your upbringing. Still, it's not a choice. And if something is not a choice, then you cannot be held morally accountable for it. Take Immanuel Kant. You may have heard of his ethical idea, ought implies can. What he means by this is that to suggest that somebody ought to do something or be a certain way, there must necessarily be a possibility that they can do so. If they can't, that is, if it's impossible to do something, then you can't say that they ought to do it. That would be like saying to a person of color that they ought to be white, and furthermore, like telling a gay person that they ought to be straight. It just doesn't make logical sense.
Where the progressives engage LGBT topics as an issue of individual rights or respect, conservatives see it as a moral issue, which are both problematic. While it is true that many progressives hyper-focus on identity politics at the expense of class solidarity and anti-imperialism, this does not mean that identity politics-related issues should simply be abandoned. Exploitation and bigotry of all forms should be completely unacceptable. The point here is that just like conservatives, progressives are reactionary when challenged on their beliefs. Just because someone claims to be pro-Palestine doesn't mean that they are. Just because someone is sad about what's happening in Palestine doesn't mean that they actually care. Every single person must be challenged on their beliefs, and you cannot simply just believe someone when they say something you agree with. Because just as all of these people here, they would take the label of being pro-Palestine or anti-Israel. And those are very different things already. In defense of their views, MAGA communists will often claim that they are merely meeting the workers where they are. But even then, MAGA communists aren't just meeting the workers where they are. They are staying there not only because they agree with them, but they fundamentally don't understand what they're talking about.
I think that when it boils down to it, MAGA communism, communism in America, in the same way that you have communism with Chinese characteristics, and it is distinctly different from Soviet communism, American communism will be communism with American characteristics based on our history, our culture, our people, and the very unique problems that we face because we are in the belly of the beast with all these issues. And our government is the heart of like all evil. It is this satanic cabal.
What we are here to talk about is the fact that China is socialist. Huh? Recognize one force represents a fundamentally counter-hegemonic position, whereas the other one represents global hegemony. Huh?
Are you saying socialist? Are they socialists with Chinese characteristics?
What's the difference?
Huh?
Define socialism as.
Okay, I think a socialist mode of production, it's a mode of production that's based in production being based on the fulfillment of some kind of politically or socially established goal.
Huh?
What a great answer. I'm imagining capitalism is also socialist when production is geared towards a social good. In order for anything to be considered socialist, it must have at least the following attributes. 1. Democratic control over the means of production. 2. Abolition of the wage labor system. 3. Abolition of private property, not personal property. 4. Abolition of the social relations of capital. This guy is one of the leaders of the American Communist Party and can't even define socialism.
Famous coward Hakim, as well as the other bisexual let's call them red libs, because there's rad libs and there's red libs. So Hakim is the face of the red libs, and Hakim has famously said that China is not socialist. We also have the Vietnamese supremacist chauvinist Luna Oi, who is also a fascist Hitlerite agent of international social democracy.
Huh?
At the end of the day, MAGA communists, progressives, and patriotic socialists are not a serious group of people. All they end up doing is promoting a bunch of ideas that not only contradict each other, but are outright wrong. Contrarians are characterized by their virtually uncritical support for anything that is anti-Western, even countries that are absolutely terrible to their own people. This reflexive worship of states that happen to oppose the West has naturally invited ridicule from across the political spectrum. And this caricature of the dogmatic contrarian has come to define leftism for many Westerners seeking convenient excuses to maintain their comfort at the expense of the global South. As mentioned earlier with the progressive conservatives, this stems from a fundamental lack of principles. Consider imperialism, given its relevance. Many contrarians claim to champion anti-imperialism, insisting their worldview is grounded in opposing imperial domination. This would be admirable if it were a principled stance. A principled opposition to imperialism may denounce it because 1. It necessitates violence against its victims. 2. It interferes in the sovereignty of other nations. And 3. Because it is intrinsically tied to exploitation. However, the contrarian does none of this analysis. They care about imperialism only insofar as it can be weaponized against countries they already dislike. Contrarians are consistent when they critique settler-colonial states or dissect global financial imperialism. Yet they can never bring themselves to condemn Russian imperialism against its neighbors. Instead, they construct elaborate justifications for why it's different. One common talking point exemplifies this, the claim that Russia is fighting Nazis in Ukraine. While Ukraine does have a Nazi problem, it hasn't crippled the Ukrainian state. Zelensky's government was even considered pro-Russia until the invasion. More importantly, Western countries have used identical rhetoric in their own invasions, substituting Islamic extremists for Nazis. The global war on terror used the same propaganda, with leading figures like George Bush to claim that they were doing God's work in Iraq. The contrarian sees through that imperialist rhetoric, but cannot apply the same analysis to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The reason is simple. The only principle contrarians consistently uphold is complete opposition to Western countries and uncritical support for anything that appears anti-Western. Never mind the crimes these states commit against their own citizens, or how aggressively they suppress actual popular movements. In the last 20 years or so, however, contrarians have latched onto one country much more than others.
The food, I want to see all the big tier 1 cities, but most importantly, I am super stoked that I'm going to get on a high-speed train tomorrow to go to Shanghai. So that's what I'm mostly looking forward to.
There exists a pronounced trend among Western leftists to uncritically promote the Chinese system as authentically socialist. Ever since 1949, China has been under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, a nominally communist organization. When it first came to power, the party was most certainly socialist. This was under the leadership of Mao, who proceeded to enact a series of socialist policies that generally improved the lives of the Chinese people. However, the Chinese Communist Party from its inception was plagued by issues resulting from its expansive bureaucratic structure. Millions of Chinese people at all sorts of levels became cadres, which was good for many at the lower levels, but at the higher levels it translated into a significant amount of rich bureaucrats who were more interested in protecting their own interests. As Wu notes in the Cultural Revolution at the margins, within less than a decade, China's transformation to socialism witnessed the metamorphosis of a victorious revolutionary party into a colossal bureaucratic state apparatus. By mobilizing the popular classes into the political process, the communist-led revolution destroyed the old political and economic elites. However, the same historical process also gave rise to a much larger and more powerful bureaucracy than that of the pre-revolutionary regime, one that joined distinct functions of revolutionary transformations, popular empowerment and social leveling, and highly centralized control in a single political formation. In effect, China had created a new bureaucracy, albeit one with a revolutionary facade. This creation of a new bureaucratic class directly threatened the development of Chinese socialism, as the bureaucrats became more concerned with protecting their power than actually developing socialism in China. These bureaucrats were also an enormous leech on the state budget, with cadres accounting for nearly 30% of the state budget in the mid-1960s. This rapid expansion of the bureaucratic class, paired with the enormous strain it put on the state, led to the Cultural Revolution. Wu summarizes as follows: the Cultural Revolution may be seen as a bold experiment to forestall the bureaucratization that had plagued socialist revolutions, and Mao's view has been compared to that of Milovan Djilas, the Yugoslav critic best known for his critique of the communist elite as a new ruling class, or that of Leon Trotsky, who criticized the Stalinist elite as a bureaucratic stratum. One thing was clear: a huge bureaucratic class was taking control of China, and the bureaucrats who immensely benefited from its existence would act in whatever way to ensure they kept their benefits. Mao could only do so much in his old age. After his death in 1976, in the subsequent 2-year stint of Hua Guofeng, Deng Xiaoping, one of the most powerful politicians and one personally singled out for criticism by Mao, took power and immediately initiated reforms. It's important here to address the disconnect between the truth of the Cultural Revolution and the way it is portrayed in both Western and Chinese media today. The goal was to forestall bureaucratic expansion in China, keeping power in the hands of the people rather than a new bureaucratic ruling class. This conflicts with narratives portraying it as a Holocaust-like event, where Mao encouraged youth to kill suspected anti-communists and destroy Chinese culture. This narrative serves the purpose of confirming what Orientalists want to believe about Chinese people being savages. But in China, this narrative was crafted by the very bureaucratic class that would come to power after 1978 as a way to delegitimize any attempt to challenge the bureaucratic class. It is this context that explains what follows. As David Harvey documents in The Brief History of Neoliberalism, the 1978 reforms initiated by Deng opened China to global trade. The dominant narrative put forward by the bureaucratic class suggests that this move enabled China to experience explosive growth and become the economic powerhouse it is today. Proponents of this narrative also like to emphasize how the Mao era had failed at developing China, and how it was only after Deng came to power that this miracle could happen. At first, there appears to be some truth to this account. In just the past 50 years, China has developed at an unbelievable speed. It has industrialized rapidly, lifted millions from poverty, and restored national dignity after a century of humiliation. Such rapid, large-scale transformation is historically unparalleled, and praise is certainly deserved. But this is not the complete story. Many people, even those who claim to be on the left, have uncritically accepted that China was held back by Mao, and that Deng made China into the world's most successful socialist state. Some even go as far to claim that the Chinese system is the best in the world. To understand why the contrarian narrative on China is fundamentally flawed, we must examine key facts and figures from the post-Mao era, beginning in 1978. As Harvey argues, China's rise has effectively saved global capitalism by providing a vast new territory for capital accumulation. By the mid-1990s, it became clear that China's huge internal market was becoming more and more attractive to foreign capital. While only 10% of the population may have possessed the purchasing power of a nascent and growing middle class, 10% of more than 1 billion people constituted a huge internal market. This wasn't a socialist transformation. It was a neoliberal turn with Chinese characteristics, one that frequently contradicted the will of the Chinese people at the time. As documented by Xu's research on the communes, the central government, now controlled by reformists, began systematically promoting cadres who opposed collectivization. In an extreme case in Hebei province, a rank-and-file pro-decollectivization researcher was directly promoted to the provincial standing committee of the CCP. Provincial-level cadre resisted decollectivization for a short time, but as soon as they realized the intention of the central leaders, their attitudes swung full circle to secure their political positions. Decollectivization disempowered peasants. The loss of collective economic interests fragmented their political power. Village leaders, in contrast, were able to concentrate political power in their own hands, and thus gain the most from decollectivization. As a result, the capitalist transformation has generated an enormous wealthy class. This elite collectively enjoys lives of luxury, while millions of people depend on selling their labor to survive. Wealthy Chinese parents send their children to the world's most prestigious universities, providing monthly allowances that easily exceed what the average Chinese worker earns annually. This elite then leverages its power to install its own members in positions of authority, systematically excluding far more qualified but economically disadvantaged candidates. China's Gini coefficient, which measures wealth inequality, reveals that China is more unequal than countries like Qatar that employ literal slave labor. Although it has recently declined, it remains worse than some of the world's most repressive capitalist states. The Iron Rice Bowl, one of the Mao era's most significant policies, which guaranteed employment for Chinese workers, has been systematically dismantled since the reforms. Today, unemployment in China is rising, with estimates suggesting rates higher than many other countries, although precise figures remain elusive due to government opacity. This crisis is exacerbated by the absurd requirements Chinese employers are permitted to impose. One recent requirement mandates that workers be under 35 years old. Essentially, losing your job after 35 can condemn you to poverty, as no employer will hire you. Labor laws are routinely ignored and rarely enforced. In the battle for China's past, Gao illustrates the reality. A Puma shoe factory run by a Taiwan businessman employs about 30,000 workers in Guangdong. The retail price of a pair of its shoes in the United States ranges from $65 to $110. The average Chinese worker gets paid $1.09 per pair, while Puma spends $6.78 per pair on advertising. The retail value of the shoes made by the worker in 1 week equals all the money paid to him or her for a whole year. In modern times, the Chinese government has systematically suppressed its left-wing critics. Websites offering genuine socialist critiques of the Chinese state or expressing Maoist sympathies are swiftly banned, and students with Marxist leanings have been arrested for the crime of celebrating Mao's birthday. Capitalist logic is so pervasive in China that even state-run media in this supposedly socialist country regularly extols the virtues of privatization. Interestingly, the state opposes private media ownership unless it's Western media whitewashing imperial crimes in Iraq. This is the miracle that Contrarians defend. The truth is that China underwent many of the same brutal nation-building processes as any other. It sacrificed its own people in pursuit of profits and capital accumulation, which is precisely why it now stands as a genuine geopolitical and economic counterweight to the West. It is undeniable that China's rise has benefited much of the world, especially the Chinese people. It is also undeniable that Global South countries would be much better off developing in line with how the Chinese have developed, rather than developing as Western countries and institutions tell them to. Simultaneously, however, this undeniable material success has played directly into the hands of leftists who view China not as a complex, contradictory social formation, but as a simple, shining alternative, a force for good, and a model to be uncritically emulated. This could not be further from the truth. This is a critical flaw in contrarian thinking, where every country is fetishized and turned into a political argument. For contrarians, countries like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are not countries where people have dreams and ambitions and where people fall in love and enjoy their hobbies. They merely exist to counter the Western bloc. And in many ways, contrarians succumb to a form of capitalist realism. They accept that capitalism is the only viable system and conclude that state capitalism like China's represents the best possible arrangement. When realizing the inconsistency of praising capitalism in an anomaly communist state, they shift the goalposts. They're transitioning. They're merely preparing for socialism. They are still on the road to socialism, completely ignoring the fact that other countries made the transition much faster and without anywhere near as much privatization, the Soviet Union being an example. What contrarians fail to consider is how all of this affects ordinary Chinese people. The extraordinary growth China has experienced has predominantly enriched Western corporations and a small cohort of powerful Chinese, mostly politicians and business owners, whereas the working class has seen its rights erode since the reforms. If anything, China's rapid ascent has most benefited the very countries that claim to oppose it. Cheap Chinese products help suppress the cost of living for Westerners, while Chinese workers see virtually none of the benefits of their labor.
So how do they react to this reality? Because young people here, they kind of choose to lying flat, and that's their way to say no to the lives they don't want to accept.
It's interesting you say that though, because I have heard that, but when I go out and I see China, all I see is people working. I see a level of development and production that is unparalleled to the US. So maybe it's because you have so many people here. I don't know.
The irony of the contrarian paradise keeping Western economies afloat seems lost on contrarians. Is it truly in China's best interest to function as a factory subservient to Western corporations and consumers indefinitely? Is it genuinely wise to base all growth on serving Western markets, or would it be better to chart an independent course? We would all agree that any country is better served by developing in its own ways that allow genuine autonomy rather than functioning as a subordinate to Western capital. But the only people who seem to disagree are those who benefit from the status quo. Another common refrain is that China is challenging the United States globally, and that China leads the international left, that China will create a new world order.
First of all, campus liberals aren't the true left. Maoist guerrillas in the Philippines, the Chinese or Cuban or Vietnamese communist parties currently in power, those are the true left.
All of this cannot be further from the truth. As Professor Gao notes, China always bows to US pressure, and the Chinese government is impotent when it is bullied by the United States. The United States continues to sell weapons to Taiwan, despite China's protests. The United States forced the Chinese cargo ship to be searched in international waters. The United States deliberately bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and a US spy plane could force the destruction of a Chinese fighter jet and the death of its pilot, yet still be allowed to land on Chinese territory. Is this the supposed leader of the global left? In an ironic twist, the real paper tiger on the world stage appears to be the Chinese government, which says one thing but does another. China permitted multiple Western media outlets to broadcast directly to Chinese audiences during the criminal invasion of Iraq, all while the government claimed to oppose the war. If China is leading a global struggle against imperialism, why doesn't it adopt a more confrontational stance against Western imperialism? The answer is simple: because it doesn't want to. China views the United States and the Western countries as partners, not adversaries. The current world order serves China's interests now that it has become a major economy with numerous highly developed sectors.
We must remain committed to developing free trade and investment, liberalization and facilitation through opening up, and say no to protectionism. Pursuing protectionism is just like locking oneself in a dark room. While wind and rain may be kept outside, so are light and air. No one will emerge as a winner in a trade war. Whether you like it or not, the global economy is the big ocean that you cannot escape from. Any attempt to cut off flows of capital, technologies, products, industries, and people between economies, and channel the waters in the ocean back into isolated lakes and creeks. This is simply not possible, and indeed it runs counter to the historical trend.
These are not the words of a revolutionary. These are the words of a leader who understands that he benefits from the global capitalist system. For all the Soviet Union's faults, and there were many, it at least maintained a clear ideological mission. It attempted to fund and arm anti-colonial movements worldwide, from Vietnam to South Africa. And as Westad states, for many of those in the Third World who oppose foreign domination, the Russian Revolution had been a single event. Not only did the Bolsheviks want to set up a new state of their own that did away with colonial oppression and ethnic domination, but they also promised to support all movements worldwide that had the same aim. In contrast, China happily trades with some of the world's most oppressive regimes. China has conducted billions in trade with Israel since its formation, and more so in modern times.
But since I've been here, I haven't talked to one person who supports Israel. It was kind of a surprise, but young people in particular truly support Gaza, like 85%, very overwhelming odds.
So much for being staunchly pro-Palestinian. If we accept that China represents the new model for socialism, a country that cannot even bring itself to cease trading with Israel, thereby materially supporting an ethno-supremacist settler-colonial project, then we have little hope indeed. Despite this, the notion of China as a global superpower rivaling the United States is now uncritically accepted by nearly everyone, both inside and outside China, contrarian or not. But the effect has been to divert attention from making genuine improvements for the vast majority of Chinese people toward competing with the United States on every front. Professor Gao summarizes this trend. The dominant public discourse in China since the late 1980s is no longer that of narrowing the gap between the urban and rural, between industry and agriculture, and between mental and manual labor, but of narrowing the gap between the West and China. But if China is so problematic, why do Chinese people seem to express satisfaction with their government? It's a result of what Herbert Marcuse called repressive desublimation. By virtue of the way it has organized its technological base, contemporary industrial society tends to be totalitarian. For totalitarian is not only a terroristic political coordination of society, but also a non-terroristic economic technical coordination which operates through the manipulation of needs by vested interests. The people recognize themselves in their commodities. They find their soul in their automobile, hi-fi set, split-level home, kitchen equipment. The very mechanism which ties the individual to his society has changed, and social control is anchored in the new needs which it has produced. Pleasure, thus adjusted, generates submission. Chinese people, like Westerners, do not have any incentive to change a system that at least provides their basic needs, regardless of how shaky the foundation is. A population whose most basic needs are satisfied will lose all revolutionary potential and produce only a subservient population. The exact same phenomenon pervades Western countries. This is the socialism that they defend, a system that provides a massive discipline and exploitable labor force for Western multinational corporations. This is not a materialist analysis. It is a faith-based dogma that demands you believe the Chinese state is the only actor in the world incapable of lying or erring.
Because you posted a picture comparing the situation of Xinjiang and the Gaza area. So that one, hundreds, thousands of fancies for you.
Yeah, it is a really stark contrast when you look at the photos or people vlogging and filming themselves around Xinjiang. And it's so incredible to me that there are various states, various organizations that are funded by the CIA and affiliated groups who are trying to push the narrative that there's something bad going on in Xinjiang. But if you look at the stats, you'd know that Muslims are treated better here than they are in America.
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
There is nothing bad going on there. It's actually...
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
China's trying to, provide some sort of economic invigoration to the people there, and they're succeeding in that.
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
And And that's why the West is lying so much about it. They're trying to, stop China from succeeding in building it up and bringing more prosperity to the people.
I cannot imagine how you would react if a Western government said, just openly on a government website, that they will strictly deal with illegal childbearing behaviors influenced by extremist thoughts. You'd be up in arms. The most incriminating thing that he cited is a study by the China Institute of Wealth and Economics that was found just freely available on the servers of China's Nankai University. The report is an evaluation of labor transfer programs for minorities in Xinjiang, and the researchers who wrote it were given special access to these programs, working directly with local authorities and other such government officials. It says some very concerning things.
It is a politics so hollowed out, so desperate for a hero, that it will defend anything as long as it opposes the West. But believing that Iran shouldn't be invaded does not require you to defend it when it massacres protesters. Pointing out Western hypocrisy regarding Russia does not require you to become a Western press release and support invading other countries. Criticizing the Western facade of democracy does not require you to call North Korea a democracy. You can acknowledge North Korea's historical context and its struggle against imperialism, while also acknowledging its profound problems of cultism, oppression, and the complete absence of democracy. There is nothing impressive about uncritically worshipping countries. You should uphold principles, not countries or leaders. This brings us to our final group, the Purists. Whether they call themselves Trotskyists, Maoists, or Orthodox Marxists, they all share a fatal flaw. They view Marxism not as one way to analyze reality, but as a theology to judge it. For the purist, the text is sacred, and the material world is secondary, and if reality contradicts their theories, then reality must be wrong. There is no better example of this theoretical paralysis than the arguments put forward by a certain Marxist regarding the relationship of capitalism and slavery.
Oh my god, bro. Oh, hell no, man. What?
To avoid any issues with YouTube, we will refer him as argues that slavery didn't significantly fund British industrialization because profits were too small to matter, primitive accumulation was sufficient, the timeline doesn't match up, and liberal ideology, rather than economics, drove abolition. But if we go through Eric Williams' seminal work, Capitalism and Slavery, based on years of archival investigation, account books, parliamentary records, and trade statistics, what we find directly contradicts nearly every claim makes. Suggests that when you run the numbers, the capital accumulation from colonial slavery couldn't possibly account for the massive investment required for Britain's industrial transformation. Not only is wrong, missing the forest for the trees. Williams found, about 1730 in Bristol, it was estimated that on a fortunate voyage, the profit on a cargo of about 270 slaves reached 7,000 to 8,000 euros, exclusive of the returns from ivory. In the same year, the net return from an indifferent cargo, which arrived in poor conditions, was over 5,700 euros. Profits of 100% were not uncommon in Liverpool, and one voyage netted a clear profit of at least 300%. The Lively, fitted out in 1737 with cargo worth 1,307 euros, returned to Liverpool with colonial produce and bills of exchange totaling 3,080 euros, in addition to cotton and sugar remitted later. An 18th century writer has estimated the sterling value of the 303,737 slaves carried in 878 Liverpool ships between 1783 and 1793 at over 15 million pounds. Deducting commissions and other charges and the cost of the outfit of the ships and maintenance of the slaves, he concluded that the average annual profit was over 30%. The slave trade on the whole was estimated to bring Liverpool alone in the 80s a clear profit of 300,000 euros a year. His mistake here is quite simple. He directly overlooks the actual processes going on and only focuses on the final result of slavery, which is the UK importing sugar or other slave products from the West Indies. This analysis neglects the creation of industry and demand the slave trade played, one being shipbuilding. Not the least of the advantages of the triangular trade was its contribution to the wooden walls of England. Shipbuilding in England received a direct stimulus from the triangular trade. Vessels of a particular type were constructed for the slave trade, combining capacity with speed in an effort to reduce mortality. Many shipwrights in Liverpool were themselves slave traders. In a port whose prosperity was intimately connected with the slave trade, William Rathbone was a curiosity in his refusal to supply timber for the construction of vessels to be employed in the slave trade, in which half of Liverpool's sailors were engaged. In addition to there were the ancillary trades. Carpenters, painters, and boat builders, tradesmen and artisans connected with repairs, equipment, and lading. Commissions, wages, dock duties, insurances, all depended partly on the ships trading to Africa. To supply the ships, there were in 1774 15 roperies in Liverpool. There were few people in the town, it was claimed, who would not be affected, directly or indirectly, by abolition. The development of the triangular trade and of shipping and shipbuilding led to the growth of the great seaport towns. Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow occupied, as seaports and trading centres, the position in the age of trade that Manchester, Birmingham, and Sheffield occupied later in the age of industry. The maintenance of the slaves and their owners on the plantations provided another market for British industry, New England agriculture, and the Newfoundland fisheries. As we see from Williams' analysis, the slave trade created markets for British manufactured goods, raw materials for British industry, and demand for British exports. Every aspect that was born because of the slave trade generated capital accumulation. It was a circuit, and slavery was central to it. What has happened here is that in trying to present a theoretical Marxist counterargument to the notion that slavery built up British industry, also overlooks the most immediate and trivial parts of the slave trade, such as the need to build the infrastructure domestically to manufacture goods to export, the need to build railways and homes, the need to create handcuffs and shackles to keep the slaves on the ships. All of this touches on key British industries. Argues that primitive accumulation was primarily an internal British process. Defines this not as the accumulation of money, but as the creation of a landless proletariat through mechanisms like the enclosure of common lands. Asserts that the fixed capital necessary for industrialization, the railways, canals, and mills, was constructed entirely by local wage laborers who were sustained by domestic agricultural surpluses like potatoes, rather than expensive slave-produced sugar. Consequently, also rejects the theory that slavery financed the Industrial Revolution. He contends that the consumption of sugar was a luxury for the upper classes, that merely diverted existing rents, rather than generating new funds for industrial investment. In his view, the key to industrial development was reducing the cost of reproducing labor power through cheap food, and that came from internal agricultural improvements and grain imports, not from slavery. However, that isn't the case either. Williams wouldn't deny that enclosures mattered, but he showed that colonial slavery was another equally important source of primitive accumulation. The triangular trade thereby gave a triple stimulus to British industry. The slaves were purchased with British manufacturers, transferred to the plantations. They produced sugar, cotton, indigo, molasses, and other tropical products, the processing of which created new industries in England. While the maintenance of the slaves and their owners on the plantations provided another market for British industry, New England agriculture, and the Newfoundland fisheries. By 1750, there was hardly a trading or manufacturing town in England which was not in some way connected with the triangular or direct colonial trade. The profits obtained provided one of the main streams of that accumulation of capital in England, which financed the Industrial Revolution. The West Indian Islands became the hub of the British Empire, of immense importance to the grandeur and prosperity of England. Williams' research showed something completely different from the luxury myth. It was the slaves who made these sugar colonies the most precious colonies ever recorded in the whole annals of imperialism. They were the fundamental prop and support of the colonies, valuable people whose labor supplied Britain with all plantation produce. The British Empire was a magnificent superstructure of American commerce and a naval power on an African foundation. The triangular trade, and the associated trade with the sugar islands, because of the navigation they encouraged, were more valuable to England than her mines of tin or coal. As Sir Dalby Thomas wrote, it all combined to spell one word: sugar. The pleasure, glory, and grandeur of England has been advanced more by sugar than by any other commodity, wool not excepted. Professor Pittman has estimated that in 1775, British West Indian plantations represented a valuation of 50 million sterling, and the sugar planters themselves put the figure at 70 million in 1778. In 1798, Pitt assessed the annual income from the West Indian plantations at £4 million, as compared with 1 million from the rest of the world. As Adam Smith wrote, the profits of a sugar plantations in any of our West Indian colonies are generally much greater than any of the other cultivation that is known either in Europe or America. Little Barbados, with its 166 square miles, was worth more to British capitalism than New England, New York, and Pennsylvania combined. As we see from here, sugar was transformed from a luxury into a mass consumption good that was absolutely central to the British economy and the reproduction of the working class. It was a cheap source of calories that helped reproduce labor power at low cost, and Williams documented how sugar consumption increased massively as industrialization proceeded. And it wasn't just sugar. Williams showed how slave-produced cotton was the raw material for Britain's most important industry. Cotton textiles were the leading sector of British industrialization. Britain's mechanized might was making the whole world her footstool. She was clothing the world, exporting men and machines, and had become the world's banker. But cotton later superseded wool in colonial markets as it did in domestic. Of a total export of 4 million pounds of woolen manufactures in 1772, less than 3% went to the West Indies and less than 4% to Africa. The best customers were Europe and America. In 1783, the woolen industry was slowly beginning its belated imitation of the technological changes which had revolutionized the cotton industry. In its progress after 1783, the triangular trade in the West Indian market played no appreciable part. But it wasn't just about whether grain or sugar is feeding European workers. It also isn't just about how much profits were coming from slave cotton. After all, where does the money come from to subsidize factories to pay their domestic employees? Where does the money come from to build roads and homes for workers to be able to come to work the next day? How are domestic workers supposed to work if it's too cold? These are questions vital to the question of the relationship between capitalism and slavery. He argues that the abolition of slavery coincided with the political rise of the industrial bourgeoisie, a class that championed liberalism against the traditional Tory alliance of slave owners and financiers. He contends that if slavery had been the indispensable engine of industrialization, the rising industrial class would have a vested interest in protecting it. Instead, the decision to dismantle the slave system, precisely as the Industrial Revolution accelerated, proves its economic dispensability. This is a fatal misreading of history, as it ignores the concept of succession. As William notes, the commercial capitalism of the 18th century developed the wealth of Europe by means of slavery and monopoly. But in doing so, it helped create the industrial capitalism of the 19th century, which turned around and destroyed the power of commercial capitalism, slavery, and all its works. The West Indians, pampered and petted and spoiled for a century and a half, made the mistake of elevating into a law of nature what was actually only a law of mercantilism. They thought themselves indispensable and carried over to an age of anti-imperialism the lessons they had been taught in an age of commercial imperialism. No serious historian would attribute all British growth to slavery, but to deny its role as the foundational capital injection is to ignore the material reality of the 18th century. One could only attribute its early foundations to it, the same foundations that Britain's rapid industrialization were built off of. He argues that the abolition of slavery was driven by the liberal ideology of the rising industrial bourgeoisie. He contends that because industrial capital was generated internally, the new capitalist class had no economic reliance on the West Indies. Therefore, the push for abolition was a moral victory, proof that liberalism destroyed slavery, not economics. The problem is that the British public in the 1830s was hardly pro-abolitionist. As historian Michael Taylor notes, Britain's role was often to thwart abolition until it became politically convenient. To Eric Williams and scholars like Walter Rodney, C.L.R. James, Gerald Horne, the reality is far more cynical. The attack on slavery was not motivated by humanitarian considerations. It was motivated by economic considerations. The abolitionists were not radicals. The attack on the West Indians was more than an attack on slavery. It was an attack on monopoly. We must understand what the West Indian interest actually represented in the 1830s. The planters were not just slave owners. They were monopolists. They benefited from the protectionist tariffs that kept sugar prices artificially high in Britain. The rising industrial capitalists, however, demanded free trade. They needed cheaper food for their domestic workforce to keep wages low, and they needed cheaper raw materials, regardless of origin. And by this time, the West Indies were failing. They simply could not compete with the massive, newer slave colonies of Cuba and Brazil. The colonial system was the spinal cord of the commercial capitalism of the mercantile epoch. In the era of free trade, the industrial capitalists wanted no colonies at all, least of all the West Indies. The trend dated back, as we have seen, to the early years of the Industrial Revolution. Its development paralleled the development of the free trade movement. The whole world row became a British colony, and the West Indies were doomed. In 1821, the British West Indies took 1/9 of total exports. In 1832, 1/17. The British West Indies were thus becoming increasingly negligible to British capitalism. It is significant that the British government abolished the slave trade only when the West Indian sugar colonies began to decline in importance and the slave trade was no longer profitable. Where before 1833, they had boycotted the British slave owner. After 1833, they espoused the cause of the Brazilian slave owner. The leader of the movement was Cobden. Cobden referred approvingly to Adam Smith's chapters in his immortal work on the expensive colonies. The colonies were expensive encumbrances, making dazzling appeals to the passions of the people, serving only as gorgeous and ponderous appendages to swell our ostensible grandeur, but in reality to complicate and magnify our government expenditure without improving our balance of trade. Meanwhile, Lord Winford, one of the leading anti-abolitionists at the time, stated his position clearly. In this political struggle, the West Indian slave owners were vitally interested. God forbid that there should be anything like a forcing of the master to abandon his property in the slave. Once adopt that principle, and there was an end to all property. He is arguing that enslaved people were legally speaking private property, and he feared that if the government established a precedent where they could strip a slave owner of their property, the government might next decide to strip landowners of their estates or factory owners of their mills. The irony of the argument is that he has fallen for the very liberal propaganda he claims to oppose. If the liberals were truly driven by morality, they would have boycotted all slave-grown sugar, but they didn't. The capitalists had first encouraged West Indian slavery and then helped to destroy it. When British capitalism depended on the West Indies, they ignored slavery or defended it. When British capitalism found the West Indian monopoly a nuisance, they destroyed West Indian slavery as the first step in the destruction of West Indian monopoly. If the abolitionists had recommended Indian sugar incorrectly, on the humanitarian principle that it was free-grown, it was their duty to their principles and their religion to boycott the slave-grown sugar of Brazil and Cuba. In failing to do this, it is not to be inferred that they were wrong, but it is undeniable that their failure to adopt such a course completely destroys a humanitarian argument. Moral arguments succeed when they align with powerful material interests, and they fail when they don't. And the archives show that abolition aligned perfectly with the bottom line. None of the arguments by are historical in any way, shape, or form, and we need to do better.
Well, this claim has absolutely nothing to do with Marx's analysis of capital accumulation. This is very different from the Marxian position, which is that capitalist exploitation arises from the very enforcement of liberal principles of freedom, equal right, rather than their violation. The whole point of Marx's Capital was to argue that.
What all of this should demonstrate to you is that you cannot just apply Marxist theories to absolutely everything by only looking at the surface level. In order to have a more correct analysis, you need to look beyond just what happened. You need to understand how and why it happened, and what its consequences were. Arguments rooted solely in abstract theoretical models, such as those proliferated by figures like and Trotskyists, they often fail to engage critically with empirical historical evidence, which is a significant deficiency observed within many elements of the left. This tendency to establish a conclusion a priori, before rigorously examining the data, exerts a profound and often subconscious influence on the selection and interpretation of information, leading individuals to neglect serious historical scholarship in favor of unsighted, ideologically conforming narratives. And this is precisely why the Trotskyist position is one of political convenience. By refusing to engage with the material world as it is, rather than how their theory says it ought to be, they render themselves historically irrelevant. In contrast, respected historians and academics dedicate their careers to a constant pursuit of primary sources and verifiable data, a process motivated not by a desire to confirm personal biases, but by a commitment to intellectual honesty and the discovery of truth. The nationalist fantasy, the contrarian, and the purist. What is the thread that binds all of them? What is the common disease? There are two main problems with Westerners: a profound material and spiritual detachment from the global proletariat, and a lack of consistently applied principles. As we established in the first part of the series, the First World left is an ahistorical phantom. It is a left that was born after the primary brutal exploitation of labor that was outsourced to the Global South, and it was a left that never had to seriously reckon with its own foundations. The Global South sits off to the side, always off the sight of First Worlders, but never too far away. Whenever the Global South is mentioned, it is either fetishized by Contrarians and Third Worldists, or it is uncritically condemned by Trots and anarchists. The progressives, just like the conservatives, talk about human rights and equality, but only to Americans. Everyone else be damned. As Che proclaimed, the solidarity of the progressive world with the Vietnamese people has something of the bitter irony of the plebeians cheering on the gladiators in the Roman circus. To wish the victim success is not enough. One must share his fate. One must join him in death or in victory. At the end of the day, if the two choices were to change the system and to end the suffering of non-Americans, or to vote Democrat to prevent the Republicans from winning, the progressives will vote Democrat every single time.